I was 26 when this happened. I was working at a small-town grocery store as the early morning baker, with a shift starting at 5 a.m. There wasn't an overnight crew at the store, so I was one of the only ones who was there that early in the morning, except for the store owner, who started at the same time as me. On this particular day, I didn't have the key to the store. I'd shared it with the other baker who covered for me on my days off. I wasn't able to get the key before my shift started, as I had off the previous day. It wasn't a big deal though. I would be able to get into the store as soon as the owner arrived. I've always been a very punctual person. I would always arrive 10 to 15 minutes before my starting time. I lived 15 minutes away in another town, but I like to give myself a good 30 minutes to get there, just in case for any possible car trouble or road closures or something like that. Maybe I'd stop off and get myself a coffee, etc. If I didn't have my key, I would just sit outside the front of the store and wait for the owner to arrive and let me in. On this morning, I arrived 15 minutes early as usual. I parked, grabbed up my belongings, and started making my way toward the store. The owner never arrived early. He always arrived there exactly at 5 a.m. sharp. I expected to wait the full 15 minutes. I always brought a book with me to pass the time. I couldn't browse through social media on my phone, since there was very poor reception in this small town in the middle of nowhere. I always parked in the back far left corner of the parking lot, so it was a bit of a ways to get to the building. I was about halfway through making my way toward the store. That's when I stopped and looked behind me to the main road, where I saw a very large truck coming down it. The truck suddenly stopped dead in the middle of the road. There was no stop signs or traffic lights or anything like that, so there was no justifiable reason this truck would stop here, especially at 4:45 in the morning. I was caught off guard by the situation. I was just standing there looking at that truck. I was visible in the dark, I guess, because I was illuminated by the light nearby of a nearby lamp post. The truck immediately flew into motion and made a sharp turn into the lot towards me. That's when I started sprinting toward the store. I should pause here and give a little context about the structure of the store. It was a multi-business plaza, with the grocery store being on the far right and some other businesses to the left. There was a little walkway between them that leads behind the building, where there's an additional parking lot, a few dumpsters, and the tree line of a nearby forest beyond that. I remembered that I didn't have the key to enter the store. The truck was about halfway through the parking lot, gunning it right toward me. When I finally reached the front of the store, I kept running past the door and down the walkway that led between the buildings. As I entered the walkway, I looked back to see the truck turning around and driving toward the store, making its way around to the back of the building. While I was driving around that side, the truck was no longer visible. I quickly ducked down behind some bushes that were planted right up against a pillar. Shortly after, I heard the truck pull up behind the store and idle there for a few minutes. I stayed hidden, looking for anything I could use to defend myself just in case. I settled for holding my car keys between my fingers to use as a makeshift weapon. My mind was racing, trying to wrap my head around what was happening, trying to devise a plan to get myself out of this situation. That was when I heard a door slam. Whoever was in that truck had now gotten out. I didn't want to peek out from my hiding spot, lest I possibly give away my position. Luckily, the bush was big enough that they wouldn't be able to spot me. All I had to do was be quiet. I sat as still as I could. I heard footsteps walking toward me. I was hoping this person would assume I went into one of the businesses and would just leave. I held my breath. I was sure that at any second they would find me and do God knows what to me. At this point, I thought about my phone. I knew I didn't have good cell phone reception in this town. and I didn't think it was worth it making noise to search through my bag for it. Anyway, my hands were gripping my car keys so tight, my knuckles were turning white. My body was trembling. My legs were aching underneath me, but I didn't want to readjust in fear of making the bushes rustle. Whoever this person was, they were now walking between the buildings. They passed by the bushes I was hiding in and headed to the front. They stood there silently looking for me. They didn't say a single word. There was nothing but the sounds of their footsteps. They walked past my hiding spot again soon enough, back towards their truck. I heard the slamming of their truck door as they climbed back in. I then heard the rumble of the engine as it accelerated slowly back around to the front parking lot. I could hear the loud engine of the truck idling in front of the store. They stayed there for several minutes before peeling out of the parking lot and down the road. After the truck's engine was no longer audible, I abandoned my hiding spot and ran towards my car. I got inside and locked the doors. I turned on my car as well, just in case the truck decided to come back. I sat there and listened, waiting for the rumbling of the truck's engine to return, but thankfully it never did. This happened to me in the summer of 2008. At the time, I was 18 and staying with my mother until college started again. She had moved to this area after I started college the year before, so I didn't know the area that well. This is important for the story. My mother often traveled for work, so most days I would be on my own. Every week, I would stop for a slice of pizza at the shop that was near the house. After a few weeks, an employee of the pizza shop struck up a conversation, asking questions like, do I live close? How old was I? What school did I go to? Ultimately, they even asked me out to go dancing. I don't remember how old he was exactly. Definitely older than 21, but younger than 40. I know that's a huge range, but I digress. Despite only having formally met this guy that day, I stupidly accepted because I was bored. I had been fairly sheltered my whole life. I was extremely shy and had never been asked out in such a way. I honestly thought I was rebelling in some way by agreeing to go out with him. I gushed about it to my best friend, who lived in the next county over. She was excited for me. I had already planned to visit her the following day and promised her all the juicy details. I agreed to meet the guy that night outside of the pizza shop. He'd offered to pick me up from my house, but I said no, simply because I didn't want to have to explain to my mother who he was if he ever decided to show up unannounced. At the time, I felt she asked way too many questions, but in reality, I realized she didn't ask enough. Whatever club we were supposed to be going to, he never named, but again, I was a dumb 18-year-old. I thought this guy was such a gentleman for insisting he drive me there. The second I met up with him, though, things started going south immediately. I parked my car and got out to greet him. To my surprise, he was still in his work clothes. He claimed he was just getting off work, which he didn't mention would be the case earlier when we set up the time to meet. I thought it was weird, but I still got in his car. He told me after I was already inside his car and we were a ways up the road that he needed to go home first and clean up. I was immediately on edge, but I didn't want to anger him or ruin the night before it even started. I reluctantly said okay. We got to his apartment and I hesitated to enter. He ever so gently put his hand on my back and steered me inside. He turned on the TV for me and told me to get comfortable. I said I was fine and shuffled my feet a bit, clutching my purse and looking around the room, mentally recounting the path to the exit. I was relieved when he went into his room and closed the door. I then heard the sounds of running water. I relaxed a little and sat on the couch to watch TV. Not long after that, he came out of his room. My mind has blocked out the details of this part, He was either completely naked or had a towel loosely covering his privates, but he was definitely not clothed. I thought about running away, but I didn't know where I was, and this was before Uber. He tried talking to me about something mundane, as if he wasn't standing in the buff in front of a girl he had just met that very same day. I answered but kept my eyes firmly on the TV. He finally gave up and went back into his room. He got dressed and came back out and said he was ready to go. I was just super glad to get out of there. I thought we were going dancing, and a lively atmosphere with more people around would make me feel much better. When we got to his car, though, he drove away until we came to a shopping plaza with stores and restaurants. In my head, I thought, there's no way there's a dance club here. Of course, there wasn't. When I said to him I thought we were going dancing, he said we were, but that we should try and eat first. Again, while internally screaming to get out of there, I agreed to go eat with him. Now I was even further from home, and he was my only ride back. In my mind, it was best not to anger or insult him in any way. I reasoned to myself that I would surely be okay in a restaurant anyway, because there would be many witnesses there if he tried anything. I shudder thinking about how naive I was back then. We got seated, ordered food, and then he started telling me about how I should try out the margaritas at this place. I reminded him I was only 18, but he said it was no big deal. He called over the waiter before I could say anything further and ordered a margarita for me, nothing for himself. The waiter asked me my age, and I thought this was my way out. I quickly and loudly said I was 18. The waiter frowned and looked at the guy, but he made a gesture I didn't really understand. Then the waiter turned back to me and said I was not old enough. He said that this time, though, he'd make an exception. I was shocked after the waiter walked off. The guy I was with chastised me and whispered that I should have lied about my age. I asked him if he was serious, half annoyed and half exasperated. I barely passed for 18. Nobody would believe that I was any older than that. He shrugged and I nibbled my food, bitterly cursing myself for getting into this mess, praying I would make it home alive. The margarita came out, and it was massive. I tried to get away with not drinking any, but the guy noticed and kept pushing it closer to me. I wanted to keep my wits about me, but I didn't know how he'd react if I continued to refuse. I took a few sips. Whoever had made this drink was heavy-handed to say the least. I was a complete lightweight and was only about 110 pounds on top of that. Those few sips were enough to get me very buzzed. I had been at college for a year by this time and learned some basics about drinking. I tried to shovel in more food to soak up some of the alcohol, but as small as I was already getting full. I didn't manage to sober up at all. Thinking back, the guy was watching me like a hawk with every sip. I kept my head down and could barely look at him. My vision was getting slightly blurry now, and I remember my eyes drooped a little too. I told him I no longer wanted to go dancing, I just wanted to go home. Before I knew it, he'd settled the check and we were back out the door, back in his car. He asked me if I was drunk with a chuckle, and I told him no, not even close. I tried my best not to slur my words, but I have no idea what I looked like. I must have looked like easy prey, because at this point he made his move. The car was small and he could easily reach me. I had a lot of thoughts in those short moments. I thought about tucking and rolling out of his car. I remembered there was a knife in my own car, and I wished I'd thought to put it in my purse. I thought about calling 911. It was that thought that snapped me out of my stupor. It was like all this time I'd forgotten I had my phone. I started looking for street signs and buildings that we passed by that I might be able to relate to a dispatcher. It didn't take me long before I realized he was just driving in circles. This made me angry and scared. I thought he was taking me back to my vehicle all this time. The word kidnapping flashed in my head, and my fight or flight took over. I abandoned all politeness and asked him why we were going around in circles. He ignored my question and said we should go back to hang out at his place to sober up. He started driving faster, and I told him I wanted to go home. He tried to convince me I could do that at his place. To my horror, the car stopped and we were outside his apartment. I turned to him and sternly told him he was going to take me back to my car right now, or I was calling the police. I also told him I had a knife in my bag, and if he tried anything else, I would stab him. I was shaking all over, fighting back tears and clearly bluffing. He didn't speak or move, possibly deciding if he wanted to call my bluff or just get rid of me. He had a noticeable angry scowl on his face. He seemed to decide on the latter option and started driving again. I kept my eyes on every street sign until I recognized where we were. The car barely came to a stop when we finally got to the pizza shop. I jumped out and ran to my car. Stupid me, I didn't even have my keys out and ready. I fumbled and dropped them. I bent to pick them up and opened my door. Before I could close it though, he was right there holding it open and refusing to let go. He was far stronger than me. He said that I couldn't leave without giving him a kiss goodbye. I briefly considered just running him over, but I decided that might not be the best idea. I gave him a peck on the cheek and pushed him back at the same time, then slammed and locked my door. He actually ran over and tried to reopen it. I turned the car on, but I was still hesitating. I was buzzed, and I knew I shouldn't drive if I was drunk. If I waited though, this guy would surely try and follow me home. I was only 4 blocks away and it was past 11 a.m. I took the chance and gunned it out of there. He had not gotten back to his car yet, so I got a head start. I checked my rear view the whole way and drove around the block by the house and parked in an alley to make sure I was not followed. I pretty much spent the rest of that night crying. He had my number and started calling and texting me many times, but I didn't try to answer. The next day, I went to my friend's house and told her everything. I was distraught and scared. The calls from him continued. This was pre-smartphone days, and I had no idea how to block his number. Eventually, my friend's older sister grabbed my phone, mustered up her most intimidating voice possible, and yelled into the phone about what was going to happen to him if he didn't stop calling. The call stopped immediately after that. I never told my mother about what happened, and I never went to the police either. I also never saw that guy again. I only ever went back to that pizza place once after that, and my friend was with me. I don't remember whose idea it was to go. Maybe I wanted to show her who the guy was. Fortunately, he was not in the front. We ordered the pizza, and I made some comment that he might try and spit in our food if he knew it was me. A rather shocked guy behind the counter asked why I would say that, and I gave him a brief rundown of what happened. He walked in the back and came back a short while later, saying we needn't worry about any of that. He assured me the guy would not bother me ever again. I grew up in a small Southern California town, known for its orange groves from days gone by. All those groves have been replaced by housing developments and shopping centers now, but there were still quite a few around when I was growing up in the 90s. My friend Johnny and I used to get into all kinds of trouble back then. We were just general miscreants, but there was one time I truly believe we almost became victims of a child predator. For anyone reading this who also grew up in the 90s, you know that was a different era. We'd be out at all times of the day, and our parents would have no idea where we were. There were a lot of kidnappings back then. I can remember multiple times I was offered candy or asked by some creep to help him go find his cat for him. I always said I'd go check with my mom, and by the time she'd get outside ready to whoop some ass, of course they'd already be gone. Anyway, Johnny and I were up to no good one day after school. We were traipsing around this orange grove that bordered his street. We started pulling these little metal dam things off the irrigation channels and tossing them wantonly. All of a sudden, we heard a sharp whistle and both looked up to see a man about 25 feet away from us, wagging his finger and going, He clearly didn't own or work in the Grove because instead of screaming at us to stop, he got a wide grin on his face from ear to ear. I can still see that face in my mind all these years later, and it still gives me the chills. Johnny and I stood there for a second watching this guy. Then we looked at each other, and Johnny looked back toward the guy and shouted to run. I looked over, and the guy was suddenly in an all-out sprint right towards us. Despite the physical exertion he was putting into his sprinting, the wide grin was still there. Johnny and I ran harder and faster than we ever had before. We made it out of the Grove and back to his house before noticing the guy was no longer behind us. We quickly forgot about it because Johnny's family had just gotten a Nintendo 64, and we started playing Mario to take our minds off it. I can't remember if it was the next day or the next week, but sometime after this happened, we were with his mom getting some donuts when we saw a wanted poster with a sketch of a man that looked exactly like the guy who had chased us that day. He was wanted for trying to grab a boy outside of a school. Johnny and I looked at each other and seemingly telepathically agreed to never say a word. I don't know why we never spoke up really. Maybe because we were at that age where we'd be relentlessly bullied by homophobes because of the mere possibility we could have been grabbed. We never did speak of it again. As I'm typing this, I'm considering reaching out to him to see if he remembers and if it aligns with my memory of the incident. There were so many things that happened in my childhood in the 90s that could have easily ended with me no longer alive. Somehow, I'm still here though, and I have my own family now. I trusted no one because of incidents like that, and I always had my head on a swivel. This incident took place in the summer of 2023. Last year, I transferred with my company to take a new position in a major Midwestern city. My spouse was still working and living back in California for the next few months. I rented a studio apartment for myself in a newly renovated apartment building in a popular downtown neighborhood, at least until we could look for a place together. The apartment was quite small, but it was also just as nice. It was in a secure building with interior hallways and a nice downstairs lobby. I was one of the first tenants to move to this newly renovated building, and other new residents soon started moving in as well. A major advantage of this move was that I'd only be a couple of hours' drive from my hometown and my parents. I started my new job and everything was going pretty great. I was quite enjoying my new neighborhood, and the neighbors in the apartment building generally kept to themselves like I did. Then a new guy moved in across the hall, and everything changed. We'll call him David. David was a single man in his 60s and was very different from the college students and young professionals who lived in our building. I started noticing his erratic behavior almost immediately. I would come home from work, only to see him sitting in his car in our small parking lot, just staring off into the distance. We were having issues that summer, with smoke clouds coming over from the vast Canadian wildfires. They were leaving a light dusting of ash on our cars similar to pollen. David was convinced that someone was spraying this dust onto his car specifically and was accusing various tenants he would run into in the parking lot. He would hoard trash in his apartment and leave trash bags in the hallway, causing a foul odor. He would also randomly start yelling at himself in the hallway. After enough time, I finally had enough and complained to the leasing office. The manager was quick to dismiss my concerns, saying she'd been in his apartment and everything was completely fine. In August, my parents' 50th anniversary was coming up, and I was excited to go home and spend a weekend with them. A few days before their anniversary, My boss informed me he would be flying in to work on an important project with me that would have us working throughout the weekend. I was really disappointed and felt like I was letting my parents down. I managed to get away for a quick overnight trip in the middle of the week to go see them though, and got back before my boss was due to arrive. I drove down and spent the night with them. The next morning I checked my email as I was getting ready to head back. There was an email from my apartment manager in regard to the incident from the night before. The email was very vague, but it stated a resident had died and there would be further details coming later. My heart sank, and I immediately went pale. My mind instinctively went to my strange neighbor David. I opened up a local news app for my city, and the top story was about an active shooter in my apartment building who was killed during a SWAT team standoff the night before. Apparently, David had approached my next-door neighbor in the hallway with a gun and threatened to shoot him. The neighbor ran back into his apartment and called 911. David also called 911 and told the dispatcher that his neighbors were hacking his phone, and if the police didn't come, he was going to kill everyone in the building. The police came and tried to talk with him, but he had barricaded himself in his apartment and was heavily armed. The police and SWAT teams soon arrived, and David began firing a rifle out his window at anyone he saw in the parking lot below. All of the neighbors on my floor were trapped in their apartments with no way to escape. They had to hunker down and barricade themselves from his random gunfire. There was another building across the street with a direct line of sight into our apartment building. A police sniper took a position in that building and shot David through his window. Then they flew a drone in through it and confirmed that he was dead, still with gun in hand. Luckily, no one else had been injured. I got home later that day to find a bullet-riddled apartment building and several neighbors who didn't normally even speak to each other, hugging and crying, showing each other videos of the incident from their hiding places. I'd never felt so lucky to have been out of town. If my boss hadn't messed up all my plans, I would have still been home that night. I'm sorry that David didn't get the mental health attention he needed, but he put so many lives in danger. This is a true story. God is my witness. I'm not making it up. I'm 57 years old now, but this is a memory that never goes away and never fades. In 1986, I stopped in Topeka, Kansas, on my way back from working in Yellowstone National Park for the summer. My friend had also just graduated from high school a few years before and had moved to Topeka with his parents. I stayed there for about a week. His parents invited me to stay an extra day, though, for their family reunion before I headed back home. We drove way out into the country for this family reunion of theirs in their old beater car and spent all day with his extended family. In the late afternoon, we were making our way back in his old beater, which had a broken gas gauge, mind you. Of course, we ran out of gas. He said we were probably 6 to 7 miles from the nearest gas station, pre-cell phone era. We were trying to figure out what to do when suddenly a van with no windows pulled over out of nowhere and asked us if we needed some help. When you're young, you still think these things just miraculously happen for you. When you're older, you know better. We told him we'd run out of gas. A friendly man then offered to take us to the nearest gas station. We got into the van, only to discover there were a total of 6 men inside and no seats in the back. We were just sitting on the floor of what appeared to be a work-type beat-up older model white van, when we clearly heard the men discussing doing us harm. The driver said he knew a good place to go. The other man in the passenger seat eyeing me agreed he was in and nodded his approval. Only one man, the one sitting nearest to us, said he didn't want to be involved at all. He had a baby now and he was not cool with this, that he didn't want any part of it. The driver and passenger seat rider said something under their breaths I couldn't make out. There was an angry silence while the driver thought this over. In my mind, I could only pray for help. My mind felt like I was stuttering thoughts. Part of me was in denial. Another part was in shock. Fear hadn't even managed to set in yet. Just like a jolt to the system of an unreal horror happening to someone else, because an hour ago, I had been completely safe without a care in the world. Now there was the absurd idea of someone raping me. Yes, I was acutely aware that they were going to do that and then murder us both, leaving us somewhere nobody would find us. These thoughts were flipping through my head a mile a minute. Have you ever been to Kansas? There are lots of lonely, God-forsaken, desolate roads to nowhere. If, at this point, the third guy changed his mind, or simply said, just let him out first, I wouldn't be sharing this with you right now. They stopped talking to each other. They had never spoken to us at all from the moment we entered the van. My friend and I didn't speak to each other either. We barely looked at each other. We were too afraid. I could hear the clanging rattle of the van's noises and the tires on the road. I saw my friend flexing as if to warn he would fight to defend himself while they were discussing where they would take us. Everything felt surreal. All of a sudden, the guy in the back just said no, and like that, the driver pulled over. The guy in the back opened the side door and let us out, and everything ended just like that. The air somehow smelled tainted. The ground looked different, like I couldn't quite trust it. My friend looked as shaken as I felt. We had just survived a close encounter with shark-like predators, the blackest, darkest evil. I looked at the gas station in the late afternoon waning sunset just before dark. It was like a safe haven of shelter and safety. I knew that once we got into that gas station, there was no way that car would be able to pick us up again. The white van with no windows pulling away from us felt so surreal. Today, I can still see that van pulling away in my mind, a sort of mirage from a nightmare that had crossed over into my waking reality. So this happened to me in 2009. I was 22 at the time, but I'm very short and often mistaken for a young teen. I had just had a driving lesson, and while normally my instructor would drop me off in front of my home at the end of our lessons, that day he had somewhere to be straight after, and instead dropped me off at a nearby bus stop. My apartment block was about 500 meters away, at the end of a long stretch of quiet road. It was an area that was being built up at the time, so there were a lot of abandoned old houses to the left and right, and my apartment block at the very end of it. That was about it. It was rare to see cars that weren't just going straight to the apartment block, because there was really nothing else there, except for a clinic a couple of streets away. You could occasionally get someone who was lost, looking for some directions. It was around 8 p.m. and it just got dark outside. The street was barely lit, but it only took a few minutes to get from my bus stop to my house, so I didn't really think anything of it. That was until a car drove past me, but then started backing up until it was driving slowly alongside me. A woman was driving, and a man was in the passenger seat. I sort of slowed down, thinking they were going to ask me for directions to the clinic. The woman instead asked me this: "Do you live here?" Now I was thinking they definitely wanted directions, so I stopped and said yes. "We're the police and we're going to take you home." Mind you, this was a totally normal vehicle. These people weren't in uniform or in any way looked official. I was incredulous, literally so stunned all I could say was something like, "You're taking the piss." Immediately, I'm thinking these people think I must be 10, and they're trying to abduct me. The woman was starting to get agitated and kept repeating, "You have to respect the police. Get in the car and we'll take you home." I was just so shocked. I was thinking, how dare you? Partly offended, they would think someone was stupid enough to fall for this. At this point, the car was stopped, and I saw the woman moving to open the door. I burst into the fastest sprint of my life while fumbling with my phone to call my mom. I was screaming before I even got to the block. "Buzz me in, I'm in danger!" My dad went out to look for them immediately after, but the car was nowhere in the area. He informed the real police, but nothing ever came of it. I've always been super creeped out by this story, and often find myself wondering what their intentions were. Did they really think someone was going to fall for that? Here we go. I was 10 years old when I met my best friend, and we were pretty much inseparable. All throughout school, we were always right by each other's side. Our last names both started with J's, so we had almost every class together as well. He was a very smart kid, an A student. As we grew up and became adults, though, we had different views on what we wanted to do with our lives. He had his first child at 18 years old, split up with the child's mom as well, so the thought of college never sat well with him. He worked a 9-to-5 trying to support himself. By the time he was 21, he'd met another woman and had a baby with her as well. This time, he was doing good, stayed with the woman, taking care of his and her other child. I was really proud of him. Then all of a sudden, though, it was like something inside of him flipped like a switch. He left that woman and moved to another part of the state. I hadn't spoken to him in 2 months after. All of a sudden, late at night, I got a phone call from his mother saying he was now in jail. I asked what had happened. She told me he'd raped a 15-year-old girl, gotten caught, and got sent to prison. He was serving 2 years behind bars, only because there were texts from this girl saying she was 18 years old. 2.5 years later, he got let out of jail. I told him he could stay with me until he got back on his feet, but he chose not to. He stayed with my mom for about a month instead. Every day, I'd try and check up on him. "Hey man, how's it going? How are you?" The answer I always got was, "I'm good, thanks for helping me out." My mom called me though and said he wanted to kill himself and had a knife in his room. I drove down there to talk him down and take the knife away. Later that night, I called him again and tried to check up on him. No answer. I called my mom, who said he was still in his room. I said to go and check. He was nowhere to be found. We both found out where he went that night, though. He had walked to his ex-girlfriend's house and apparently was spying on her and her boyfriend. He walked behind the house, ripped his shirt off, and shoved it in a crack of the window. He then lit the shirt on fire and walked away. He attempted to kill his own child, his ex-girlfriend, and an unrelated man for no reason. Luckily, the adults in the house were awake. They smelled the fire and got the children out safely, then called the fire department. My best friend admitted to this and has been in prison ever since. No matter how much you think you know someone, you never truly know them. So, when I was a kid, I had this whistle that was honestly pretty shit. It was super obnoxious and had this terrible but very distinctive sound. It was like the dying cries of a goose, followed by a rattling noise. It always hung off a bright orange lanyard, which I'd hook on the door handle of my front door. Every morning, I'd get up and see that awful whistle hanging right there. Now, right next to my front door was a window that didn't quite latch properly. It wasn't open all the time, but if you pushed on it for long enough, it would give way. One night, it was raining hard as hell. I woke up at 4 a.m. to the sound of banging downstairs. I assumed the wind had blown the window open, and I didn't want the carpet to get soaked. I got up and went to close it up again. Sure enough, the window was wide open. As I went to close it, though, I heard something from out the window. In the distance, I heard that whistle. As I looked, I saw it was gone. The lanyard and the whistle itself were off the handle, and someone was blowing that whistle somewhere out there in the storm. I checked the house from top to bottom, and nothing else had been stolen, just that single whistle.